My dad got his first movie camera in the late 1930s when he was 16 years old. He captured his family on film and dreamed of being a professional cameraman. That's my dad, Israel Shopsowitz, standing behind the table. My father went into the family restaurant business instead. Still, he kept his camera with him. In the late 1940s, he took this film of the family's corned beef booth at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto and continued shooting. I love these images. I don't see my father, but I like to think I'm seeing the world through his eyes. His pictures are one of my greatest treasures. My father kept detailed notes on his films, but I hardly need them. Half a century after these images were created, they are immediately familiar. It's as if my father knew that one day there'd be another filmmaker in his family. Years later, I'm making my own home movie, traveling with a professional film crew in search of other amateurs who have given us their personal view of the world around them. And of course, I'm using my father's camera. It's not just me who's obsessed by home movies. What's often been regarded as a lowly art form has attracted the interest of archivists from all over the world, including Pam Wintle of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C.
There is that magic of the moving image and watching that sort of draws you in and sucks you in a way. I mean, obviously there's more relational material there as you watch people move through their own space. So when you look at a still photograph, it's a frozen moment in time, whereas when you're watching the image move, it engages you in a different way, and it sort of transports you also in a different way.
Like a lot of people my age, I grew up in front of my father's camera, along with my sister, my mother, and my big brother. I'm so grateful for these images of the past. That's me again, age 9. Like many home movie makers, my dad shot most of his footage on family holidays. I've traveled to Gatineau, Quebec, to meet Bill O'Farrell at the National Archives of Canada, where Bill is the chief motion picture archivist.
I think the whole sensibility about what a home movie is that most of us have in our head is a kind of a 1950s vision of, often it's not color, and usually a family vacation in a station wagon, or, you know, the wife and kids at the beach sort of thing. And it's not particularly accurate when you see the diversity and the scope and just how far back amateur cinema goes.
It actually goes back to about 1895. This footage was shot by the Lumière brothers in Paris, France. They created one of the first movie cameras and used it to film life at home and on the street. Here, the Lumière brothers have turned their camera on the annual ostrich parade in downtown Paris. When I saw the Lumière brothers' footage, I realized that they had set the standard for all of those family films of the future. Here's my own sister, Shelley, caught at mealtime. Early on, cinema divided into two streams. There were professional films, shown to audiences of strangers in public settings, the Nickelodeons, And there were also professional single-reelers. Action, comedy, romance, putting real movie stars on screen in your own living room. Eventually, you could even buy films of surgical operations, a form of home entertainment that continues to capture our imagination today. But some people wanted more. They wanted a family album that moved. And that's where George Eastman came in. With Monsieur Julien Tessier of France, Eastman created the Cine Kodak Model A, one of the first popular home movie cameras.
So Eastman insisted that it be sold only as a package: the camera, the tripod, the projector, the screen, and a splicer. He wanted to be sure that the customer got good results, and he obviously couldn't do it without a tripod. And then the only projector available for 16 was the Kodak projector. So that was sold, the outfit sold for $325 in 1923. That was a lot of money.
In 1923, the average North American family earned less than $1,500 a year. But there were enough wealthy people to create a market for moving picture cameras. Kodak made 1,286 Cine Kodaks that year, and soon there were labs across North America to process the film.
A lot of the early advertising tries to emphasize the difference between a static photograph and actually seeing yourself move on the screen. And you've got to admit, it was quite a thrill to see yourself on the screen. A lot of people just couldn't believe it.
Alan is a collector of cameras, projectors, and films who has written a history of the home movie camera. The film may have been moving, but that didn't mean people in front of the camera knew what to do about it. And that's been an age-old quandary. My own family perfected the art of doing nothing when my dad was shooting. As for my cameraman, well, these bears, shot by my dad in 1941, are some of the more natural models I've seen. We're on our way to the tiny town of Bucksport, Maine. Bucksport, located on the Penobscot River, is home to Northeast Historic Film. This archive is located in an old movie theater and may be the largest collection of home movies in North America.
When people are shooting their own movies for themselves, as they are with amateur works, it's really coming from inside them in a very different way. And they're able to tell you something with, we think, a lot more profundity and a lot more feeling. And that's why I became interested in it.
One of Northeast's great treasures is a sequence of several films made in 1916 by local businessman F.B. Richards. A round of calls shows F.B. and his wife doing just that, calling on their neighbors. F.B. also tried his hand at drama, and so became a part of amateur film history.
I think you can make an argument that it may be one of the first amateur films ever made. I mean, you've got folks in Blue Hill Falls, Maine with a hand crank 28mm camera, and they're filming a stage play. And you go like, well, this is, I think it kind of stands the whole concept of amateur cinema right on its head.
It's people who have costumed themselves, and it's from a single shot, and it's weird.
F.B. Richards shot the story of Snow White long before Hollywood got around to it. For his set, he used a nearby country club, and local children were his performers.
We started out with a particular home movie called From Stump to Ship, which was the history of one man's work in the woods. And it was a 16mm film. It was something that he did to record all 4 seasons of woods work. So it was done by an amateur, but it was really about his work life and the people who worked with him. So that was our start, and so we were conscious that they weren't just about what was taking place in the home, that amateur film encompasses all of everybody's lives, and people will go out and film those things that are important to them.
It was becoming very clear to me that home movies were about more than just baby pictures. By the way, that's me in my first on-screen appearance.
I think that we, in our own generation, think that we're inventing everything anew. And what film is so great for is that it shows you the continuity and the fact that our parents and grandparents were as astute and crazy and messed up as we are.
People were finding new ways to entertain themselves, including American President Calvin Coolidge. There was a spirit of nutty optimism. There were jobs, people had plenty of money, and there was a lot to spend that money on. If you were poor, you could even buy what you wanted on credit. In 1928, the McLaughlin family of Oshawa, Ontario filmed someone riding a bicycle along their mansion's rain gutter. The feat isn't quite as impressive as it looks. The rain gutter is 6 feet wide, although it is a long way up. The world in front of the camera was suddenly full of loony daredevils, trying new and astonishing stunts, and then watching themselves on screen, beating all the odds. In the late 1920s, Eastman Kodak made a promotional film showing all these new hobbyists how to use their Cine Kodak. Even professionals turned peculiar around a home movie camera. Production assistant Sherry forgot that my Super 8 camera was silent. Our soundman Steve made his own home movies, but couldn't help mugging in mine. And I just had to shoot cameraman Antonin on one of his exercise breaks. We're off to Ithaca, New York to meet Patty Zimmerman. Patty is a film professor who's been studying amateur movies for the past 20 years.
The archive of amateurism is an archive that is expanding infinitely. And it can only expand through the vision of people who understand that images made by anybody matter.
Even when that anybody is a somebody. Recognize this man? It's Groucho Marx. A lot of the big stars were given home movie cameras by the camera manufacturers as a way of promoting home movie making to the masses. I'm not sure who's shooting this footage of Groucho, although some Hollywood stars even had their own cameramen who made their home movies for them. I wonder if my dad fantasized about going to Hollywood. When he shot these marquees in Los Angeles, did he think of moving to Beverly Hills?
In the same way that film schools talk about talent, so did the Hollywood industry and the commercial producers talk about, how do you make good movies? Okay, and there's a famous book called How to Make Good Movies. And how do you define good? Well, good is the pinnacle, and the pinnacle is Hollywood. It is pictorialist framing. It is clearly against constructivism, surrealism, futurism, all those kind of nasty intellectual European art movements that us pragmatists are so scared of. And it's about what's a good movie. A good movie is Hollywood style. Continuity editing, smooth editing.
In 1932, O.P. Gear, an amateur filmmaker from Connecticut, chronicled a day in his family's life in elaborate detail. Decades later, this film has become a record of traditional suburban life and the local A&P store.
I think one of the things people don't really recognize is that families were incredibly creative. And we look back to the time before film, people did all kinds of dramas in their home, and they entertained themselves through long winters. And when cameras came into the home, people were perfectly willing to take those things that they had done together as families and with their friends and put them on film and put a lot of effort into them.
Like a lot of home movie makers, O.P. Gear even made his own titles. Others got them made at the lab for a nominal fee with processing.
I think one of the great things about the Meyer Davis film, among other films, is that they're totally saturated with popular culture. And they're very well read. They're really aware of what the trends are. Freud clearly was all about us and part of who we were becoming in the 20th century. And they made fun of themselves and their preoccupations and all of their obsessions as a family. And it's a really great way to see our culture.
Meyer Davis was a musician and a band leader who would spend his spare time making movies for his family and friends. Miss Olympia, made in 1939, is an example of Meyer's off-center genius.
One of the great things about Miss Olympia is that we're still so obsessed with our body images, particularly as women. And here's someone who's completely out there, surrounded by young women who are equally either repressed or loose, and we can all find ourselves in that film.
Women are so often featured on film. Were any behind the camera?
What you find in the 20s is you find a gendered division of labor in amateur cameras, that there are cameras marketed to men, and they, as you might guess, tend to have longer lenses. They tend to have more technology involved, more manipulations of the camera because of this, I think, an embedded ideology that men have a chromosome linking them to technological sophistication and that women are mutated and don't have that chromosome. And you find cameras then for women marketed in bizarre kinds of ways. They are smaller. They have very small little lenses. They're often embossed and decorated. They come in different colors, appealing to our fashion instincts. They're made to fit into pocketbooks. And they're advertised also with an incredible adage. Kodak did this, Bell and Howell did it with a phrase, so simple to operate, even a woman can use it. I think it's out of film.
It was usually the women who kept the family records, so it was natural for them to make home movies. In the late 1920s and 30s, Elizabeth Woodman Wright used her camera to capture daily life on the family farm and the antics of the local children. Dorothy Ashbridges of Toronto was a socialite, a traveler, and a tireless amateur movie maker. And in my family, my dad took most of the movies. But he also taught my mom how to shoot, so he could be part of our family's cinematic history.
I think there's this sense of children grow up and lives are fleeting, and let's capture this moment and let's stop it for a moment.
My dad's films have become so important, especially now that both my parents are gone. Our next visit is with Peter Forgash, a Hungarian filmmaker who works almost exclusively with amateur film.
Amateur film means that we have the ability to understand and reread things. And this is something what is strikingly different from the sentimental and nostalgic, oh, look there, how nice I was. Normally, these home movies are used to illustrate how idiotic is the bourgeois family or the middle class family, or to illustrate something which is obvious. But to me, these pictures mean something else. It's a kind of gate to time, and it's, on the other hand, it's a kind of death ritual. So photography is a graveyard. And funny, but the moving image is something else. They're still alive. I mean, that is the illusion. And there they are, all these ghosts coming out from the graveyard.
The Lure of Home Movies, that promotional film by Eastman Kodak, actually tells movie makers how to go about preserving the past. In the 1920s, if you were wealthy enough to afford the camera, you probably could afford the lifestyle that went with it.
Also, you begin to realize that there was a definite tourist route around Africa in the 30s, and you wanted to see how the exotic other was representing themselves, or chose to represent themselves to the tourist. And this changes over time, and so it's a really fascinating way of watching tourism develop, watching how people, other cultures represent themselves to each other. And you can only do this by having various examples of moving images from people who did this over a period of time, so that you can start comparing it, and then you can begin to tease apart the differences, the similarities, and beginning to develop an understanding again of how did we develop our worldview.
When interviewed about this film, 40 years after it was made, amateur movie maker Mortimer Fuller said that this particular bit of footage was actually shot by a doctor on the trip, who was studying the incidence of breast cancer among African women. With old footage, we rarely know what the filmmaker was thinking. We have to guess the meaning and the context, or supply our own.
When people take out the camera from the box and start to shoot, they don't have in mind to make a historic document. They have in mind that this moment of life is worth to be recorded. That makes home movie something special.
In 1941, my father and his family drove to North Bay, Ontario to see the Dion quintuplets, the first ever born in the world. It's easy to splice my dad's footage with a newsreel from the period, but there are differences. My dad's films are in color, and the newsreel's only shot in black and white. And my dad, as an amateur, could only shoot this poster of the girls. The newsreels got a lot closer. Put the two films together, and you get a new sense of the Dion quintuplets carnival. It might have been fun then, but not now.
The home camera captured an amazing amount of unpremeditated contextual material, and some of it is very painful for us to see today. For example, it could include a town's Ku Klux Klan parade. It could include domestic arrangements with which we are no longer comfortable. And these were things that were probably not the primary interest of the person who was shooting, but when we look at it today, it really hits us on the face.
After filming his hometown's Ku Klux Klan parade, this amateur gives us this shot. The Smithsonian is home to this footage, shot by Harry Carney, a member of Duke Ellington's band. It's amazing to watch the Duke relaxing at the keyboards in somebody's backyard. And it's also amazing to watch Harry Carney's images of the vicious racism the band confronted on tour in British Columbia in 1940.
I think that, you know, when you think of an American, you still think of sort of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and despite the fact that it's a land of immigrants and there have been so many different people from the beginning, I think there still is the conception that, you know, American is pretty Caucasian, pretty white. So I think that, you know, to see these images of really America in the making, and you see people with Asian faces in period clothing in the 1920s, you know, doing just very obviously American things. So like with the newspaper, you know, he actually, I guess, filmed himself sitting in the couch, you know, reading the newspaper, which was a very male sort of fatherly thing to do. But on closer look, that you see that it is a Japanese-American paper rather than, say, the Los Angeles Times. It's like recovering a little bit of history that would have been lost. And I think there's so much history that's already been lost, that to find every little piece and to know how what it can do, you know, what work it can do, the utility actually of really showing, for us, is showing the Japanese-American story as an American story.
Toronto in the early 1930s, official footage, professionally shot. and Toronto in the early 1930s, the Solomon family scrapyard, as shot by Joe Solomon. It's real life, home movie version, complete with the expected goofing around. And here's a shot of my own grandfather, reading the local Yiddish newspaper. Joe Solomon shot this footage of a group of businessmen meeting in downtown Toronto. I too was struck at first by the gentleman showing off his unzipped fly, but then I discovered my own grandfather, right next to him. Any home movie footage of my grandparents is precious, since the only way I know them is through my father's camera. The Depression might have stopped all those amateur movie makers cold, but the camera makers came up with a plan. In 1932, Eastman Kodak introduced the 8mm Cine Kodak model. 8mm film was basically 16mm film cut in half when processed, giving you twice as much footage for one low, low price.
And this was Depression, and we were shooting 8mm, so Bob would shoot a half a roll, and then give me the camera for a weekend, and I would shoot the other half roll. And then he'd get it processed.
That's where the movie clubs came in. If you couldn't afford to have a camera, you could afford to join a club, and like Charlie, borrow from fellow members, like Jack Carey.
Just taking pics is lots of fun, but still it's not enough. You'll have to join our movie club to bring your work to snuff. There's lots of rules for making films. You'll learn them to the letter. Like if you take the lens cap off, your pictures will be better.
Toronto is home to one of the oldest movie clubs in the world, dating back to 1934. In 1939, the Toronto Movie Club chronicled the visit of the royal couple to Toronto. They used almost every member of the club to cover the event from vantage points throughout the city. Newsreels were shot in black and white, but the movie club members and other hobbyists captured all the pageantry in beautiful Kodacolor. Film clubs were huge in the 1930s. They got their start in the early 1920s by Hiram Percy Maxim, a Maine native, who was also the inventor of the modern gun silencer.
Hiram Maxim shot family films of various kinds, travelogue and his tours overseas. And he also did a family drama called Mag the Hag. And his daughter, Percy Maxim, and that was her name, her christened name was Percy, acts somebody who is transgendered in the film. And it's a romance, and it's also pastoral, and it's completely peculiar. And it's not all what one would expect, and I don't think it was written up anywhere in the Amateur Cinema League literature.
camera and accessory manufacturers were giving amateurs advice about how to make their films more appealing. And amateurs improved upon these suggestions to create some incredible innovations. This film is by Toronto Movie Club member Charlie Woodley. Here's a title sequence created by O.P. Gear in 1932, which used melted wax. As for this trick, it's not double exposure. O.P. Gear used an inverted camera and lens duplicator to achieve this effect. But I still have no idea how he did it. In 1931, Dent Harrison used double exposure to create another Dent Harrison for a short experimental film on the visit of the R-100 airship to Canada. Here are the two brothers watching their film. You didn't always need tricks. My father's visit to a soft drink bottling factory is chronicled in true documentary style, from start to finish. For Jack Carey, making amateur movies about bees and nature took him into professional filmmaking. The Life of the Honeybee was sold to Encyclopedia Britannica and became one of the distributor's most popular educational films.
I had a lot of fun out of being able to make amateur films strictly for fun. No idea, I mean, I've never felt right from the start that you could hope to cope with Hollywood, but I was just fortunate in choosing nature, and there was a pretty good market for that. School films and that sort of thing.
Did Charlie Woodley ever think of being a pro?
I gave up movies, as I said, when I started to teach. I was using the slides. And then they started, well, they brought in sound. And that was too much work. That was another problem. So I've never got into video at all. So I'm out of it now. I just observe.
In 1969, my dad hired a professional to record my sister Shelley's bat mitzvah. It was a big event, and my dad didn't want to miss a moment. Yet somehow, in all the excitement, I was nowhere to be seen in the final film. My sister says I cried when we screened the movie for the first time. Maybe I was hiding. I was pretty shy. My parents realized that such an oversight could scar me for life, so they came up with a solution. A few weeks later, my brother and I dressed up in our party outfits. And I think my mom's behind the camera, because even my dad had a part to play in take 2 of Shelley's bat mitzvah party. He later spliced this new footage into the film, and here I am. It's a demonstration of love and imagination, and the power of home movies.
Body language, kinesics, relationships between people as they're expressed in family photography is incredibly revealing, and it allows you, when you come back and look at it in retrospect, to think up all sorts of narratives, some of which may be completely fictional. But this is great then, because you've turned the material of everyday life into a thrilling, fictional narrative, or maybe, you know, you in retrospect understand some things about your own family, which might not have been clear when you were younger.
Rick Pralinger says there's much to be learned by what people shoot and leave out.
People shoot a lot of flower gardens in home movies. You know, it's to my great dismay. You see weddings, but you don't see funerals. Funerals are generally unphotographable. Teenagers disappear around puberty because they're not eager to be photographed. Women will sometimes expose themselves or allow themselves to be revealed by a man in home movies when they would be very embarrassed to do it otherwise. Kids are often unwilling subjects of home movies, and you see that a great deal. A lot of home movies are about that dialectic between a controlling parent and a controlled kid who has sort of no choice but to react when that camera is shoved in their face. Kids are, you look at a lot of home movies around the holidays, people, you know, kids have to come out and look at the Christmas tree in order of size and then pretend to open up their presents for the camera. There's this staging of family life. But you know, these things still happen, and they happened before there were home movies. It just happens to be that between, you know, roughly the 20s and the 70s, we have a very nice body of documentation of people in North America and a little bit elsewhere.
It was in the early 1970s that my own desire to star in my dad's home movies temporarily dwindled as my teenage angst increased. Eric Krasner is a private collector who picks up many of his films at estate sales.
Anyone who's looking for a scene to set a time period or a mood, my home movies have been used in Mercedes-Benz commercials, HBO, Showtime, ABC. I'm seeing more and more home movies added into commercials. In fact, they're shooting a lot of stuff to look like vintage home movies, which really is crazy because it's more expensive. But that amateur look, you know, either overly lit or underlit, and, you know, heads chopped off or a shaky camera, it has a distinct look to it.
By 1939, my father had become the official school movie maker at Harvard Collegiate in downtown Toronto, shooting football games and other events. When the Second World War broke out, my father's camera captured the changing world around him. These are Army cadets in high school. Many of them must have wondered if they would ever become soldiers. 2 years later, some would be dead. My father shot this on a beach holiday in New Jersey. It was a training exercise called The Invasion of Atlantic City. A home movie of a rehearsal for a war. American soldiers training on the beach. Then the real war. Ross Rudolph took his home camera along during his tour of duty in the Canadian Navy.
This is again where we had exercises.
This was shot on D-Day, 1944.
You can see how rough it was that day. This was after they had taken the first wave in, and they came back to the ship, and we had to try and hook the falls on and bring them back up on board.
Ross had his duty on board ship during the invasion. He gave his camera to someone going ashore. He's kept the film ever since in a cookie can in his basement. It's an incredible find. Amateur footage, in color, of the landing in Normandy.
After the invasion of the islands off south of France, they took prisoners, and German prisoners, and what do you do with them? They brought them back to the ship, and the wounded. There were Canadian and British wounded and German wounded, and the wardroom was set up as an operating theater. And this was, as I say, two of them died, and this was the burial at sea. The chaplain with the they were buried with full military honors. I realized that today was going to be gone forever, and unless some record was kept, that it would be gone.
I think it's very instructive to know that when the Nazis occupied Holland, one of the first things they did was ban the use of cameras, amateur cameras in public. I mean, the Nazis in some ways are the world's most sick geniuses about technology. Why? Because they wanted to control and Nazify the public sphere so that any image created was in their control. This was an edict during the occupation in Holland that anyone who had an amateur camera could not use it in the streets. And this was, I believe, also true in Germany. The only people who had the right to make images were the Nazis or the Nazi occupying forces.
Amateur filmmaking becomes an act of resistance, and newsreels were viewed like home movies. As they played in North American movie theaters, people in the audience looked anxiously at the images, desperate to find the faces of their loved ones, to know they were still alive. You find the price of the war in other pictures. Norman Irwin, who owned this large cottage in Muskoka, shot this film. Irwin was the commanding officer of a Canadian Air Force base in Quebec. His camera shows these men, damaged emotionally and physically, starting to make new lives for themselves. Those lives would never be the same. In North America, the war meant rationing. Most of the color film went to the war effort. If you could get your hands on a couple of rolls, home movie magazines urged you to keep calm with home movies. When the war finally ended, the home movie camera caught the accelerating changes in the way North America lived.
Oh, give me land, lots of land under stars.
Cross-country drives, when people started when the highway system was starting to develop, a lot of people brought their camera around, shot right from the car, roadside attractions, bridges, anything that they stopped to see, they would get out of the car and film it.
Let me be by myself in the evening breeze and listen to the murmur of the cottonwood trees. Send me off forever.
That also, kind of replicates Manifest Destiny, Settlement, usually in a westward direction. People take home movies going west, much more often than going east because they're replicating a pioneer journey, and I find things like that very interesting.
Suddenly, home movies were really moving, even if the pilgrimage was just around the stable grounds in a park in Toronto, or on a plane journey. I started, and my dad finished this sequence.
And gaze at the moon till I lose my senses, and I can't look at hovels, and I can't stand fences. Don't fence me.
My dad shot this at Union Station in Toronto in the 1940s. And he shot this at the Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto, also in the 1940s. On leave in Britain, amateur movie maker Harry Ronson, who now lives in London, Ontario, made a short day-in-the-life film of his family.
I went home one weekend and asked my family if it was all right. I'd like to shoot the family. Now I got this new camera, so they sort of, well, I don't know. If you like, go ahead. So I'm very glad I've got it now because it's priceless. All my family have gone, and I just have the record of them being around in those days.
There is some amateur film that just stands out there on its own. You look at it and you say, wow, this is really important stuff, there's no question about it. And there's other material that the value lays hidden. And it's when you start looking at the context, like what actually are these images of? Who are these people? Where were they living? When were these shot? And when you find out that background information, the images can take on, no matter even how badly shot they were, they can take on a whole different meaning and sometimes be incredibly poignant.
My dad shot this film in New York. I can just picture him standing there in the middle of Times Square, dazzled by the bright lights, the advertising, and the theater marquees. Then he looks up and sees this. American News Service in Germany says all Nuremberg executions have been carried out.
Home movies have been fetishized because they look a little bit different, but I have a feeling that they're going to come into their own in another way within the next few years. I think, there's going to be a great deal more focus on personal expression and personal experience as opposed to institutional expression and experience, because I think people will, there will be enough people that will be able to watch that and read their own lives into it or get something back when they bounce. They send off a ping and a feeling or an emotion comes back.
Home movies are important, and archivists around the world are trying to preserve them.
We're saving material that would go to the dump. We've had people call us up and say, I found this at the dump. And then it's material that you can actually reconnect to a family. One of the awful things about videotape is that people who brought material that was on 16 millimeter and had it transferred to video thought that then they had done a preservation job. So they did throw it away.
Once a month, Eric Krasner webcasts highlights from his home movie collection.
And yet, if I dragged out my projector and invited neighbors to come over to watch old home movies, they'd all find an excuse not to be here. And you throw it on the internet, and 600 to 700 people, you know, come to watch. And the thing is, I mean, when you shoot it, you think, well, nobody's going to see this. You know, it's only... And then I buy your films at an estate sale, and looky here.
Which makes me want to lock up my own footage. Seeing all these video cameras, it seems like we're all inadvertent bystanders in somebody else's home movie. Each picture is unique, yet somehow we duplicate these images time and again. My dad taught me 3 things about making movies, and I apply them to life as well. Always edit out the bad stuff. Be as steady as you can, and of course, follow your dreams.
The way you wear your hat, the way you sip your tea, the memory of all that. No, they can't take that away from me. The way your smile just beams, the way you sing off key, the way you haunt my dreams. No, they can't take that away from me. We may never, never meet again on that bumpy road to love. Still, I'll always, always keep the memory of the way you hold